Hello, my lovelies. I'm Ginny O, the author with no last name, and today it's Building a Culture Part 4. How do cultures interact together? So, I have actually made kind of references to this in previous videos about building cultures because I was using America as an example of cultural world building. America being 50 moles in a trench coat pretending to be a country. And, we have a lot of different cultures in America. You have New England culture, you have New York City culture, which is different than upstate New York culture. You have, and even in upstate New York, you'll have different little culture groups. You have Southern culture, and Southern culture in Georgia is going to be different than Southern culture in Louisiana, which is different than the culture in Texas, which is different than the culture in Tennessee. So you're going to have a lot of different things, and different than Appalachia, because Appalachia has their own thing. You have Midwest culture, which is going to be different from state to state. You're going even, different sides of South Dakota have different cultures. And, you have West Coast culture, which you'll have California culture, which is a lot different than, the cultures in Seattle and Portland, and even if you're outside the cities, you're going to have a very different culture than what's going on in the cities or what's going on the coast. So you have to think about, as an author, how do your cultures interact with one another? What is the history over time of how did these cultures meet and collide? And in America, what our cultures are as this kind of, you have native indigenous cultures, which were tried to be stamped out by European colonizers who deliberately, and in some cases maliciously, misunderstood what the indigenous cultures were doing with the land and the way they interacted with each other, so that they could claim that the land was empty and unsettled and open for use, that people could just come in and take it. Now, we aren't the only continent they did this on. They did this on North America, they did this in South America, they did this in Africa. And about the only continent that somewhat did not do this to is Asia. But, the Pacific Oceans islands, yeah, we did that too. But in Asia, when we got to Asia, they were so big already, and they had all these armies already, that in this massive culture, that we kind of were like, oh, okay, we're gonna invade India here, but we're not gonna invade China or Japan. They're too busy invading each other, type of thing. So you have to think about, in America, we had the indigenous cultures, and then we had all these different groups coming over from Europe, whether they were British, whether they were Britons kicked out of Britain, went to Netherlands, and then got kicked out of the Netherlands, and Britain said, we're not taking you back. Yeah, there's this place over the ocean. Yeah, why don't you go there and send us lumber? Yeah, that seems like a compromise. Or whether or not they were, Spain or Portugal setting up prison colonies and things like that. They brought their culture and they brought things over with them, like the Spaniards brought the horses, type of thing. So, and then as more people came over, first we had our war with, the French and Indian War, and, which was going to determine who was going to, in the upstate areas, who was going to be you know, the determining factor. Was it going to be the British, or was it going to be this kind of conglomerate forces of the Dutch and the French and the Native Americans and the indigenous people culture and the British run, which is why New Amsterdam is now New York. Uh, and, you know, you had kings in other countries being like, oh, I am going to deed you this much land and you can take people over, which is how we got Pennsylvania, type of thing, and, you know, settle this type of stuff. And then we had our Revolutionary War, which was once again kind of multiple things going on with King George over there. And, you know, the different colonies having different reasons to do this. And then, you know, we had more settlers come over, bringing their own culture with them. And, you know, it was this constant kind of, we would have a war, and one of the European cultures would, like, dominate. And then we would have an influx of immigration from Europe. And, you know, more different culture groups and different, you know, food and art and architectural styles would be imported, and more marginalization of people of color would happen. It's, you know, not a great thing. And then we'd have another war, and then it would do this over and over and over and over again. And you know, things would, you know, we would have people of color who were enslaved. They would come to the North and they would settle in the North, and they created their own culture in New York City and, you know, other places. And that was different from the type of culture that they had in the South, or, you know, they had in New Orleans and stuff like that. And, or people would come from, we would have settlers that were kicked out of Canada, and they would come down to Louisiana and they would form their own culture, and it would mix with the Black culture down there. It's just one of those, how do your cultures interact with each other? Now, the example I'm going to use for this video is Mercedes Lackey's Valdemar, because she is one of the few, this is romantic fantasy. It's not high fantasy, it's not epic fantasy. It's more along the lines of low fantasy, because she doesn't necessarily explain her magical system. It just kind of exists. But she has written quite a lot in this universe. And she had a map of, this is the current time and the time of Selene, and she had a timeline of what was going on throughout the ages, and she was writing books at different points in the timeline. So this book came out in 1994. So I'm not entirely sure. I stopped reading somewhere around the Owls series, I think. So I'm not entirely sure how much more this timeline has been fleshed out. So when you have to think about cultures, type of thing. So they're in the beginning of this, in the very beginning, it was the time of Urtho. Okay, and Urtho was fighting a war against this guy called Ma'ar. And Urtho's fighters were a bunch of free people who had a lot of different cultures, and they worshipped different gods, and they had, they practiced a similar type of magic, and he was considered this really great mage, so he had these, what he called permanent gates, that would take people places, so that his armies could be around safe when they're not out fighting Ma'ar's armies. They could be safe and around his kind of tower, where they could get food and magical healing and, you know, mental health stuff to, you know, and train and stuff before they were redeployed through a gate to take on Ma'ar's armies. And Ma'ar was just conquering everything and turning the world into a wasteland, and you had to believe things his way. You know, Ma'ar was never really explored that greatly, because, you know, we were supposed to like Urtho. Well, Ma'ar was going to win. Ma'ar had managed to basically kill Urtho in such a way that Urtho was basically, once Urtho died, everything was going to explode. So all of Urtho's armies, they had to open up these huge gates and disperse as fast as possible. Catastrophic event was coming. And while some of them were in the gates, the event happened. And they were flung even further than they thought they were going to be. So a lot of the armies that were together were parts of the same cultural groups. They worshipped the same gods. And some of the armies weren't. So you ended up having several groups that end up influencing the time of Selenite. So one group went out and they became the Empire. And they decided, once they established themselves, they were going to start gobbling up everything else around them. They decided they were just going to fight. And they had this kind of pantheistic notion of gods. You worshipped 100 gods and your ancestors. There was no real, dual system or mono system or tri-system of gods. There was just 1,001 gods, and they really didn't have much to do with everything. And the emperor himself is a god because the emperor is a mage and he can pretend to be a god if he likes. And they worship the emperor. And part of what happened was there was an emperor or sometime later, I don't know how many centuries later, after founding or before founding. Okay, so 1,000 years later after this event, the empire was so corrupt and so horrible that one of the barons decided he was going to up and leave. And he gathered everybody around him, and the modern emperor is like, why didn't you just go to the emperor? This makes no sense. Why did you just go to the emperor? But he gathered up all his retainers and his families and everybody, and they created a gate, and they gated as far away as they could think of from the empire, hoping that the empire would never come back. That only lasted 1,300 years. So, okay. But they gated away, and they got to this place, and it was just absolute wilderness. There was like nothing there. Maybe there'd been like some small person there, small thing there, but there was nothing, and they needed protection. So the Baron Valdemar went to this grove and he prayed to the gods, and the gods sent, a white horse, because they were so afraid of, the corruption that happened in the empire, they wanted a safeguard against that happening ever again. So the gods sent a magical white horse. And the magical white horse basically, eventually multiplied. Eventually there was another one. And they bonded with all the magicians. No matter what type of magical power you had, a white horse would come get you, and they would bring you away to a school where they'll teach you about honor and integrity and the rule of law and justice and such things. So that it didn't always work, but they were kind of like this safety guard against the mages in particular going rogue. And then there was another group, there was a cultural group that worshipped a goddess of stars. And after the cataclysm happened, they were split into two groups. One group had been flung so far away they ended up in the deep, deep south next to a kingdom where change technically doesn't happen except by order of the king. And so they preserved their culture as much as they could with as minimal changes as possible. Despite the fact that they were living next to a culture that only does change by order of the king, they they still had this, they did not have that type of taboo. They tried to preserve it as much as they could, but they didn't really have that taboo, so their culture still shifted. So they still, worshipped the goddess of stars and everything, and, had their old language. They tried to preserve their language as much as possible, but they were so far away, they were cut off from everybody else, that, there was no, for them, there was, like, no thought, no hope about getting back, unless absolutely positively necessary. And then the other group had been managed to get back to where the Mage of Silence's tower had been, and found a crater instead of a plane. They found a crater, and they had this kind of reaction. One of the groups wanted to give up magic entirely, and they had come to the conclusion that magic was just corrupting and bad. Even the Mage of Silence, who was this supposedly very moral and upright person, had been corrupted by magic. Look at the destruction that he cast upon the world. The only people who should have any type of magic at all are history keepers and storytellers, and we don't want anything to do with magic. And so the goddess is like, okay, you, in exchange for giving up magic, I want you to do this for me. And they were like, okay, we accept. So they accepted that task from their goddess. But the other group, they split, and they were like, we still want to use magic. And the goddess was like, okay, you still want to use magic. And they're like, but the land around here is, like, terrifying. Plants were acting like animals, and you had all these kind of weird merged creatures. And the goddess was like, okay, you still want to use magic, but you need protection from the land. So I will give you protection from the land by these special heartstones, and in return, you are going to clean up the mess. You didn't create it, but you're going to clean it up. So they decided to clean it up. Now, one of the other groups, there was a culture that worshipped a sun god, and they got split up. One group ended up in one place, and they founded a theocracy, and they became kind of corrupted over time by priests, which happens, and they believed that the white horses were, signs of the devil. Once they ran into Baron Valdemar and his group, or now King Valdemar and his group, they saw the white horses were from the devil, and that the riders of the white horses were from the devil, because they were mages, and very, very weird. Even though that there were priest mages among, the theocracy, they had, magecraft. Certain types of magecraft are bad, and because the white people of the white horses use that type of magecraft, they're bad and evil. Despite the fact that they had their own version of the white horses for their theocratic leaders, called the Firecats. Okay, so the Firecats. And there's a lot less Firecats than there are white horses, which is, sad, because, they were cool. And so, the other group that also served this god came up with this kind of a completely different other governing system of, games. Basically, they have these war games. It's a whole bunch of bread and circuses to decide who should lead. And it's not just, I'm gonna beat on you until you're dead type of thing. There's a lot of, like, riddles and, logic problems and obstacle courses and stuff in order to decide who's going to lead and, who gets the resources. So, you have this culture completely wrapped around doing games, because they were a mercenary unit who happened to have a group of these priests with them to, who called upon the sun god, and they wanted a way to keep their aggression tamed. So, and eventually they decided that they did not want anybody coming into their land. So, because everybody around them was, fighting each other type of thing, and they were just, oh so fed up with it all, so that they asked their god to put a kind of magical wall around their land so that only certain people could come in and out of their country. Magic isolationism at its finest. And, so you have all these cultures kind of, there the empire is expanding and gobbling up more people, and, the theocratic culture has decided everybody else are demons, and, if they get too over the border, that they're gonna fight them all. You have your typical kingdoms that have corruption and other, inheritance issues, and they decide, oh, they see this land and they want to try to take it over. And then you have, the country, the cultures that are more isolationist, like the one culture that's on the plains, and then the other culture that is cleaning up with the mess. And then, so how do your cultures interact with each other, and how do the gods and goddesses and the religions of your cultures work together? Because in the theocratic state, they also think that Valdemar is anathema, because Valdemar pretty much has a freedom of religion, and a lot of the apostate little churches that were in their state, upped and moved to Valdemar when, if the choice is either I get executed for blasphemy, or I leave and I go to this place where I can worship my God in my way that I want to, and nobody's going to stop me, type of thing. So how did your religions interact with each other, or how do your cultures interact with each other? What kind of influence does colonization, or catastrophes, or even royal marriages or wars have on, what's going on? So by this book, by the Storm books, we are back to having a catastrophe, because the catastrophe made an echo through time and is now going back in reverse. Yes, you did hear me right. It is coming back in reverse. So, and it had a big bang and it eased off, and now it's easing up to a big bang. And they have to avert the crisis in this book. And, all the different cultures get to interact together, and, you finally get to see what's really going on, like, in the Empire and stuff. And this is actually one of the few longer series that I have read that does this type of thing. So if you're working on, I don't know, an epic fantasy, or a longer form fantasy, or a longer form science fiction, The Expanse does this. I know The Expanse did this with, the Mars people versus the Belters versus the people on Earth. Earthers, they had different cultures, so they were trying to do this war between cultures type of thing. Even kind of like the old Gundam Wing would do this, like we're at war between the planets and the colonies type of thing. Maybe that's kind of why The Expanse as a book didn't really hook me. The TV show is good, but the book, not so much. So, you can see a lot in classic science fiction, even if it's just kind of like a singular book. I know the Dune series did it. I'm trying to think of some other things that kind of play with this. Not Star Wars, yes, and Star Wars, no. But just when you're thinking about your world culture and where you're sitting today, think about how the history of your world and how the cultures kind of interacted with each other, whether it was through peaceful trade, whether it's through colonization, whether it's through war, or whether it's through this, like, if you have some sort of massive magical catastrophe. All right, which means you're gonna be like, Jenny, you mean I have to build more than one culture? Yes, monocultures kind of don't exist in reality. You can have a monoculture, but you better have a very good kind of reason for it. I believe I have a project I'm working on that does kind of have a monoculture, but it took like 2 major catastrophes and basically the strongest kind of magician on the planet stepping in and going, look, you do this, or else I just let this do its natural thing and everybody dies. So, I don't care one way or the other, but you might. So please, you know, this, we are going to sit down, we are going to negotiate out something that, you know, will have you all working together instead of creating this huge massive war that has swept up everybody in the bid for power that is going to kill everybody eventually if we don't stop now, type of thing. But, you know, not all, you know, not every single concept, especially fantasy concept or science fiction concept, is going to work for that. So, like, you have to just, I don't know, think about it. You know, that way you're gonna be coming up with cultures, and they're gonna, you know, be influenced by each other and what's going on. So you might have cultures that have different magical powers, like Mercedes Lackey did, because for a time, Valdemar only had mind magic powers, so like telekinesis and stuff like that. And because one of their mages had cast a spell to watch other normal mages, and he was killed before he could like tweak it so it wouldn't annoy everybody. And so that went on for several hundred years before he was like, his ghost was tracked down, and he was like, oh yeah, I kind of was not able to finish that. Here's how to fix it! Oops, type of thing. So they might have different, you know, they might have different powers, they might have different manners, they might have different types of dress, they might have different religions. They might start out with the same religion and have their religions, you know, branch out over time. A Coptic Christian is not the same as an Eastern Orthodox Christian, which is not the same as an evangelical Protestant Christian, which is not the same as a Roman Catholic. And even the evangelical Protestants are not the same as each other. And I'm not going to go into that list because we'll be here a while. So just think about that. Think about how your cultures are going to interact with each other and how they're going to change each other and what type of events would change each other over time. And you know, what type of powers and what type of manners and what types of dress and art would they have, you know, depending on, are they trying to be a rigid monotheistic or a rigid culture that doesn't change, or are they a culture that embraces change, so their language is going to drift a lot and their manners of dress are going to drift a lot over time, and you know, they're going to be borrowing from other people over time. Alright. Take care of yourselves, my lovelies. Bless, stay safe, and I will see you in the next video.